The impact that the people in this story had on humanity isn't because they accomplished great things in and of themselves. It's because they walked with God. Their impact was how close they were to God and what He was doing. That's why we know their names.
Welcome to the Reach College Podcast with your speaker, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
All right, who in the room has 4 living grandparents? 4 living we got one, couple. You guys are like, maybe they're alive? Like, okay, so we got a couple. Okay, who can name 2 of their great-grandparents? Who can name 2 of their great-grandparents? Okay, we got a few in here. Who can name all 4 of their great-grandparents? Okay, all right. Somebody.
Great-grandparents.
What?
People have 8 great-grandparents.
Oh yeah, I guess that's fair. Who can name 8 great-grandparents? We got one. We got one maybe? Did somebody over here say they could name 8 great-grandparents? Anybody? Okay, I want to hear as many as you can.
Oh, my great-great?
Yeah.
Like comments. Chuck, Richard, Mary, Suzanne, Kelly, Jay, Jan.
I don't know your great-grandparents, so you could have made all those up. I don't believe you. Sarah, Nikki, Bob, Judas, I don't know. Yeah, we got all of them. So that's good. That's great. Honestly, impressive that you got, like, that. Did you grow up with any of them, or? No? You just... Okay. And you just, like, have heard all the stories? Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. So we had one person in here that can name all their great-grandparents within reason, even if we were not on all of them. But here's the thing: there's only 3 generations ago, right? Like, and how many of your great-grandparents are still alive? 2 of the 8. Okay. So think about this: most of you don't know anything about your great-grandparents. Like, most of you have no idea, like, even the smallest stories about them. I have, like, vague memories of, like, 2 of my great-grandparents. That's it. That's what I got, right? So here's the thing, like, what kind of, like, legacy is even possible to be left in this world? Right? Because, like, unless your, like, grandparents, like, their name is on, like, a library, in which case you're like, yeah, it's named after, like, one of my great-great-great-great-grandparents. And, like, that's it. That's the equivalent of your excitement about that thing, right? So the thing that I want to point out, because we're going to be in Genesis 5 today, and we're going to look at the genealogy. And part of the question is, what's the point? Like, what is the point of human life? Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? What is the goal? Because if you think about it kind of in the reverse, we went backwards, but, like, your great-grandchildren won't have any idea who you are. I mean, again, unless you get your name on a library, in which case they might be like, yeah, neat, that was my great-great-grandparent, right? But other than that, what impact is that going to have in a real way on your family or other people? So we went out of order in Genesis so far. So we went up to chapter 4. Then we jumped to chapter 6 and we did the flood story. Jilly just did 3 weeks on Noah. Well, before we go further, we're actually going to go back to chapter 5. And if you know what chapter 5 is, it's the genealogy, right? Now, part of the reason that we're going to do the genealogy is because what happens about every January is that you guys are, like, all motivated and you're like, I'm going to read the whole Bible. And you're like, somewhere around the 5th day into that plan, depending on how fast you're going, and you're like, I am so bored, right? Because you get to the genealogy and you're just like, this guy had kids and this guy had kids and that's great, And so there's, like, this kind of, like, what is the point, right? Which is the exact same question, right? Like, why do we have the genealogy? What's it there for? What is the author trying to tell us when we look at this? And what I want you to see is that the genealogy has meat on it. There's a reason that it's in there. It's important. In chapter 4, we had Cain's line, right? And we see that manifest all the way to this guy named Lamech, who's basically bragging about murder. And then we know, based on the way we've gone through it in this class, that things get so bad in Noah's time that there's a flood. So there's this gap chapter, and the question is, what is going on right there? It's Seth's line, right? It's not Cain. It's not Abel. Cain was the firstborn. It should have been his line. But he commits murder. He disqualifies himself. And he murders the other candidate, Abel, so he can't take the line, right? So now we're on to the third son. We're on to Seth. And Seth is going to be the person who God's promise continues through. So look with me, if you will, at chapter 5, starting in verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. On the day when God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and He blessed them and named them mankind on the day when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Then the days of Adam, after he fathered Seth, were 800 years, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now Seth lived 105 years, and fathered Enos. Then Seth lived 807 years, and after he fathered Enos, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Okay, so it starts off by restating something we saw in the creation story. He made them in His image, male and female. And it adds, and they were blessed. Right? Something good was happening here. And then it does this weird switch when you get to verse 3, and it says that Adam had a son in His image. Right? In His likeness. And so there's two things happening here. The first thing is we are being shown that the image of God is continuing, right? That's why the chapter starts with a re-emphasizing, yes, God made man in His image, and now man is having sons in his own image, right? And so part of it is the continuation of this reality. Sin did not stop God's image from moving into humanity and multiplying, right? But then the other piece of this is it switches to the language of Adam's image and Adam's likeness. Why? Because the image of God that's in Adam has been corrupted. It's been marred. And now, original sin is being passed off. That's why we have the added note when it says they were created in God's image and they were blessed. And now, Adam has a son in his own image. Right? Because he is passing on the image of God in a corrupted way. And all of humanity is going to suffer from the corruption that has entered the image of God in us generation after generation. We're all going to be affected by that now. And that's why you're born into slavery, right? You've heard me say, when we talk about this idea of like, how am I born a sinner? Right? I haven't done anything yet. Well, if your parents are slaves and they have you, you're born into slavery. And that's what we're being shown here, is that everyone who's going to be born from Adam, who sold himself into slavery, is going to be born into that same slavery. So, he's passing on that brokenness, and there's something we have to address here. The long ages, right? You ever look at this and you're like, 900 years a person? This is nuts. Like, and it doesn't, there's no way to like even conceptualize that with our experience, right? Like we have no guesses at what's going on there, right? So there are several answers. One is that the more fundamentalist answer is this is a closed genealogy, and a closed genealogy means every part of this is to be taken at face value, and it is all literal. It is that each person lived, they were named this, they lived this many years, and at these segments of time they had the next kid, right? That's a closed genealogy. Everything is just as it is on the page. There's nothing else to it, right? The second option is that it's an open genealogy. It could be skipping people, right? It could be not saying, maybe if this guy had a kid who had another kid and they omit the middle person for the sake of moving the story along. Now, the problem with the open genealogy is it doesn't address some of the seemingly literal ages, and we'll get to those, but there's some specific ages at the end that look too specific and too literal to be just figurative language. So it's really hard to wipe that away when you get past the flood and Noah's hundreds of years old, right? Because that story is very much literal. There's not even a genealogy happening in that moment that explains why they're still saying he's that many hundreds of years old, right? So it's really hard to get around that. The other kind of option for the open genealogy type thing is that it's not talking necessarily about individuals, but it's talking about the patriarch of tribes. So, Seth is the patriarch of the Sethites, right? And they lived 900 something years, and somewhere in there was a new tribe that started out of them. Again, there's almost too much going on in the passage that makes us have to bend over backwards to make that work, right? It doesn't seem to fit what's happening in the text. Really, why do we need that option? Why do people want that option? It's because we have to find a way to explain the long ages in our context that just denies that could have been possible, okay? Now, part of the reason for that is because of the worldview in our culture, right, is that humans are getting better. We're improving. So it can't be that we used to live for 1,000 years and now, but if you think about it, what is the Christian belief system? It's that they are the closest to perfect humans that anyone has ever been. They're living immediately after the fall. There's less disease. There's less, there's whatever. Every condition is set up for them to be healthy longer than us. No genetic problems have set in. They don't have, you want to talk about the intermarrying of your family members that seems to be apparent, right, in the first segments of Genesis. Well, part of the reason that becomes taboo in the ancient world is because there's genetic diseases that come with that, right? But those maybe aren't present at the very beginning of creation. So you have a lot of room here to say they are healthy. They're living a long time, right? Now, a third option is the selective genealogy. Now, selective is that it's a literal reading of some chosen names, but it's not a closed genealogy where it's this guy had this kid who had this kid. It's more loose than that. It's, some of the things that do point to that, right, is there's 10 names, and the 7th name is intentional, right, in both Cain's genealogy and Seth's, and it's those are so seemingly well placed that it appears as though it's more of a literary structure, a tool, than what are the odds, it just so happened that between Adam and Noah it was exactly 10 people. And you could chalk that up to God's divine providence. And it's possible that the point is not that they didn't live that long, or not that they they weren't literal people, but just that we only picked certain of those people to highlight because that's not the point of the story. Remember, we talked about creation myths. We talked about this idea of what a myth is. It doesn't make it untrue. But if you had gone to Moses and said, you changed this guy's name, you made it a fictional story, he'd have been like, what are you talking about, right? Because they would have read that and said, well, we don't care if his name was Jack, because the name that we gave him in the story was making a point that the story was trying to make that's true, right? So they wouldn't have seen that as a fictional tool, right? And so you have to keep in mind there's cultural disconnects from the way we view what fact is and the way they did, okay? And it doesn't mean that theirs was less valid than ours, okay? But you have to read this book as an ancient text, right? That's important, okay? So we have these multiple options. We know that the long lives could be because they are closer to perfection. There's a lot of theories about how the flood changed the environment, right? We could have a different climate. We could have all kinds of environmental differences that happen. I mean, think about it. It's a worldwide climactic event, right? We do believe the flood is literal. We do believe it was worldwide. And so because of that, that changes the world around us in, who knows, I mean, crazy ways, right? So one of the keys as you read this is don't judge things that are happening in literally the first chapters of Genesis by your experience, okay? Minimum, this happened 6,000 years ago, okay? How much of your life is similar to theirs? Almost none, all right? Almost none. So don't be like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. People don't live 900 years. Yeah, of course, that's a long time ago, all right? So let's not judge that based on our current spot in the world, okay? Again, the bottom line is it gets really hard to argue Noah's apparently literal age at the end of the genealogy. So that's why I am going to default to at least this is a selective genealogy. At least it's literal where it's supposed to be literal, and it's literal in the ways that an ancient Israelite would have said it's literal, right? Not maybe based on our definition. Okay, look at verse 9. Now Enos lived 90 years and fathered Kenan. Then Enos lived 815 years after he fathered Kenan, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. Now Kenan lived 70 years and fathered Mahalalel. Then Kenan lived 840 years after he fathered Mahalalel, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Now Mahalalel lived 65 years and fathered Yared. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years after he fathered Yared, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Now Jared lived 162 years and fathered Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he fathered Enoch, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Okay, why is this passage in the Bible? One answer, it could be a credibility thing, right? We have genealogies going through the Bible all the way from Adam to David, David to Jesus, right? We have every name. Once we get to the genealogy of Jesus, we have all kinds of detail, okay? So one reason is credibility. I heard a story about a missionary who was hastily translating the Bible into the language of the country he was in. He skipped chapter 5 because he was like trying to get them some of the more meat and potatoes. He goes back later, he translates chapter 5, they read chapter 5 and they go, we thought you were making this up. But you have the genealogy like this. These are real people. Blew their minds. All of a sudden they're all in, right? Because it's not just a fairy tale. It has the force of fact behind it, right? Think about that. So that's a very different perspective than we're coming at it going, 900 years, really? They looked at it and they were like, we thought this was fake until the genealogy got in there, right? So it could be a credibility thing. It also can be showing, and here's what I primarily think is happening in this passage. It's showing that God's command, God's will, is happening. God said, be fruitful and multiply. That was His command to humanity, and it is happening. In spite of the fall, it's continuing forward, and the seed of Eve that's supposed to save humanity, it is, in spite of Cain's attempt to ruin everything, it is still moving through the lines, and it's passing through the Sethite names all the way down, one generation at a time, making its way forward. So God's will is unstoppable. Again, I called this series in Genesis the March of Redemption. There is no other passage that exemplifies what my point is better than Genesis chapter 5. We are just trudging forward as redemption creeps onto the scene, right? And then when we get to Noah, you're going to see, Jilly showed us that literally God is redeeming even in that early stage, right? Not in the perfect way that Jesus someday will, but already. He's already redeeming. So Seth's line is really giving themselves to God's plan. We saw at the end of chapter 4, when we're talking about Lamech, that they're paired up right there, and it says, well, Lamech's kids were known for these things and these things and these things, but Seth and Enos, they were known for crying out to God. They were known for that. And so as we enter the Sethite line, we're seeing people whose focus is their faith. Their focus is walking with the Lord. So I was looking up phobias this week, and I'm going to be honest with you. Not being a psychology major, I don't know how many of these are fake. I was reading all this stuff, and some of them sound so stupid. I was like, there's no way that's real. So I'm just going to read a few. I found trypophobia, fear of images with patterns of holes or bumps. Not fear of things with holes or bumps, fear of pictures of things with holes or bumps. Emetophobia, fear of throwing up. Gamophobia, fear of marriage. That sounds like just Gen Z in general. Somnophobia, fear of sleep. Lutrophobia, fear of otters. That one's fun. Ablutophobia, which is fear of bathing. So I think that's like a 5th grade thing, right? Like every 5th grade boy ever. And then, honestly, if we're going to talk about like the truest form of fear, like what is all humanity trying to avoid, it's called thanatophobia, the fear of death, right? And I think that's interesting. Caleb's not here, so we can talk about it openly. But Thanos, right? Like that's what that reminded me of immediately. So, so basically, the bottom line of this is there's a lot of fears out there, and I know that we've all grown up with that like kind of mythical thing where they're like, everyone's worst fear is public speaking. That's a worse fear than death. I don't buy it. And actually, I heard a speaker talking about it once, and he was saying that the fear of public speaking is actually the fear of being ostracized. So it's a fear that you'll stand up and say something that will get you ostracized from your community. And why would that be a fear? Because then you die, right? Like that's an instinctual thing. Like as soon as you're ostracized from your community, you don't make it, right? And so again, what are we talking about? Fear of death. It's always the fear of death. That is what all of humanity has been afraid of and trying to avoid for all of human history, right? So look at verse 21. Now Enoch lived 65 years and fathered Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he fathered Methuselah, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay. The author, up to this point, has gone out of his way to mention death. Now, you may not think that when you read chapter 5, you're like, well, he's just telling that they lived this long and then they died. But you got to understand genealogies. It's implied that they died. Like, there's no reason to tell you that every person in the genealogy died. Unless you're trying to highlight that at least one person in the genealogy didn't die. See, here's what's happening. The author has been like, yeah, this guy lived and died. And you're like, yeah. And this guy lived and died. Mm-hmm, got it. And this guy lived and died. And you're like, dude, I get it. And then he's like, and this guy lived and didn't die. And you're like, what? Right? This is intentional. This is supposed to grab you because the pattern that we just read for 20 verses is completely disrupted when we get to this person Enoch. It's a whole different thing. It makes Enoch stand out. So here's what you need to see. Enoch is the 7th person from Adam in the line of Seth, which is essentially the number 7. We've talked about this a lot. The number 7 is the number of perfection. So if we're looking at the line of Seth as a whole, the line of Seth is going to be judged by what has happened by the 7th generation. Well, the same is true for Cain's family. And these are going to be paralleled because we just got told that the 7th generation from Cain is a murderer. And now we get to the 7th generation from Adam through Seth. And this guy walks so closely with God that he is literally snatched off of the earth and taken away by God. He just ceases to be. Now, here's the question. Was he perfect? Did he earn salvation? Did he earn heaven? What are we looking at here? In Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 5, it says, "But by faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him up. For before he was taken up, he was attested to have been pleasing to God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For the one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he proves to be one who rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." I want you guys to see something. We're going to look at Enoch and we're going to look at Noah today, and I don't want you to mishear me at any point and say, look at how good these guys were. on their own. These are descendants of the line that's putting their faith in God. This is the group that's looking to God for the answers. They're crying out to God. They're walking with God. So Enoch is not just comes out just tap dancing and is like the perfect child, right? He is seeking the Lord. He's walking with the Lord in faith. He believes in the redemption that God is promising. He cheats death. Now, I just told you that death is like the single greatest fear we have, and this guy figured out a way around it. Right? He did something right. Well, how? How do we avoid death? Micah 6:8 says, He has told you, mortal one, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. I want you to see something. Walking with the Lord is life. I'm not telling you that you might actually escape death. I mean, it took Enoch 365 years, right? Like, you don't have that long. So good luck, I guess. But the reality is, Enoch understood that the most important thing in life was to walk with God. And he walked so closely with God, he actually did avoid the experience of death. And in the same way, even though we will pass through death, we will never cease living. We'll just go from this incomplete life, this partial life, and if you're a believer, you'll pass through death into a perfect and eternal life. It will be almost the same thing in that you will just continue to live. That's what Enoch went through. There's only two people in the Bible who escaped death. Enoch and Elijah. Elijah is taken up. It's actually the same verb is used for what happens to Elijah when he's taken up as what's used right here for Enoch. They were both taken by God in a moment away from the earth to not even experience death. Complete side note, I can't prove it. There seems to be a reference to these two prophets in Revelation that will come and be killed. And a lot of people think it's Elijah and Moses. A theory is that it's Elijah and Enoch, the only two people that haven't died yet. Because if you read that part in Revelation, they die then. And so the only people that have ever essentially had death, had not had to pass through the experience of death, will come back and still experience it. They will still pass through it. So it's an interesting thought. But what did Elijah and Enoch have in common? They walked with the Lord. They walked so... Listen, if you go study Elijah, he's a man of great, great prayer. He literally brings rain just by sitting down and praying about it. He stops rain by praying about it. That's how closely they walked with God. They understood that was the point. Now, you could look at this and you could be like, well, Enoch's life was cut short. Like, he didn't get to live his full life. First of all, you've missed the point, right? He got taken from the brokenness down here to true life. And secondly, I read a couple scholars say that that's the reason that the number, now again, whether this is literal or this is meant to make a point or both, the reason he lives 365 years is it's a reference to the lunar calendar, 365 days, and the idea is he lived a full life. He got everything you could get down here plus some, and then he went to be with God in the perfect life. He didn't have to stick around here and stay in the brokenness, right? That is what is truly happening with Enoch. Again, I'm not saying that you won't experience death. I'm saying death is not the same consequence to those who are walking in faith as it is to those who aren't. Because you will pass through death right back into what is real life. Life is walking closely with God. That's what life is. And that's why you've heard me say the phrase, you can experience your eternal life starting now. Because the moment you become a Christian, you begin to walk with God in an imperfect way, the way that you will someday perfectly walk with Him in heaven. If you're saved, You're already experiencing heaven in a way that the rest of the world, people who are not saved, guess what they're already experiencing? They're already experiencing hell. And that's why God left brokenness in the world, but He gives us a taste of everything made right in the way that we will someday see perfectly. So Enoch's son is Methuselah. Methuselah is known as the oldest person. He holds the record for longest life. I saw a picture this week of a man who seems to be crying out to the Lord with a woman kind of on his case. And it says, Methuselah, after his wife brings up that argument from 700 years ago, had a long time to have some experiences. So look at verse 25. Now Methuselah lived 187 years and fathered Lamech. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he fathered Lamech, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Now Lamech lived 182 years and fathered a son, and he named him Noah, saying, This one will give us comfort from our work and from the hard labor of our hands caused by the ground which the Lord has cursed. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he fathered Noah, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Now after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay. We see somebody in the Sethite line named Lamech. Now, there's a lot of wording that I didn't have time to go into that seems to be talking, what happens is we jump to the beginning of chapter 6 and we have this phrasing where it's like the sons of God and the daughters of man and then the Nephilim, right? And everyone's like, demons had babies with people and they were giants. And it's like, probably not. So how do we understand though in context why that's probably not the case? We back up, okay? So what we do when we back up is we see that a lot of the language that leads to sons of God and daughters of man, it's coming out of the chapters leading up 4 and 5, and it's pointing to that sons of God is a common reference in the Bible to the children of God or the people of faith, and the daughters of man. Keep in mind the audience. We're talking about the Israelites who are running around in Numbers right now. They're running around in the wilderness, and they are being just told over and over again, don't marry the Canaanite women. Don't fall for it. Don't marry the Canaanite women. We even have this evil wizard that basically God has like a battle of will with, and when Balaam is his name, when he finally gives up, he goes to the king and he says, yeah, just send your women. Just seduce them, right? And that'll fix that problem. And God gets vengeance on that guy for causing that trouble. So that's the audience, right? So we're building to this point of, what are we seeing right here? You've got the Canaanite line and you've got the Sethite line. And even though one line is of faith and one line is not, and they should not be intermingling, the sons of God, the Sethite line, are looking at this lustfully at these women from this other line, and they're intermarrying. And the reference to the Nephilim, I think, is that there were these great men. Again, we're closer to creation. We're closer to perfection. They're the greatest men that have ever lived in this time period. And yet, even with all these great men on the earth, things have gotten so bad we need a flood. That's what's happening. And it happens because righteousness intermingled with unrighteousness, right? You don't bring it up, it brings you down, right? So the thing that blew my mind this summer was the guy who was like, the law is about not touching unclean things because when we touch unclean things, they make us unclean. But when Jesus eventually comes, everything unclean that he touches, he makes clean. I was like, well, did you just back that up? Let's do that again, right? That like blew my mind. Well, here's the thing. We're shown over and over again in the Bible that when we touch, when we're trying to be clean and righteous and we touch unclean things, we don't fix them, they break us. That's what happens every single time. So that's why we need Jesus to touch us. So that is the wording that leads up to where we're going. And part of this is we're going to see that we've got two Lamechs. And how do we connect the Lamech from each line? Well, the Lamech in our current line, it said that he lived 777 years, which is the perfect number, right? It's talking about a complete life, right? And the reason that that's tied in with this other Lamech is because that Lamech said, I will avenge myself 7 times, 70 times, right? What he's saying is, I will commit evil perfectly against anyone who harms me. And now we're shown a Sethite Lamech who is instead walking with God, and he walks with God to the completion of a perfect life, right? And so that is the comparison we're having here that's setting up for the beginning of chapter 6, where we have these two lines that shouldn't be intermingling, okay? Now, I'm going to talk to you guys about something today, and I want to put a disclaimer on it. I almost never get anything for my sermons from YouTube. But today, there was a video that I watched and I wanted to study a little bit, and I took this video and I compared it to commentaries and scholars, and I found out that it was wrong in several places. But we're going to talk through it because there is something here that's interesting, and I'm going to be careful to describe to you why it's not quite as clean cut, just in case you run across. I mean, I'm sure some of you will just look this up immediately afterwards, but there is a YouTube video that talks about what the names in the genealogy mean, and how there's a gospel presentation essentially in the names, okay? And it is nice and tight. It's so nice and tight that when you watch the video, you're like, why has no one ever told me this before? This is amazing. And no one's ever told you because it's not that clean cut, at all. But you don't get likes on YouTube for going, I don't know, maybe. So he presents it more clean cut than it really is. So the first thing is, so I'm going to go through one at a time. You have Adam. Adam's name means man or mankind. Everyone agrees. Then you have Seth. Now, the video says that Seth's name means appointed. It actually probably means granted or supplanted, right? Why? Because he supplanted Cain. He was granted to Eve. But essentially he's given. There's at least the spirit of it is similar, right? You could say he was appointed. Enos is, the guy in the video says his name means mortal. I looked it up. It means weak or fragile. So that's fair. That's a fair one to be equal. And then Kenan, this is the one, that guy's just it means misery. And nobody knows what Kenan's name means. They think it means a certain kind of god, it's a name of a god, but no one I read had a definitive answer on Kenan. But let's stop there at 4. What we see is the story we're being told by the genealogy so far is that mankind was given over to weakness, right? They were given over to a mortality, right? So that's the first part of the Genesis story. What does the gospel start with? Everything's wrong. Everything's broken. So I can get behind this so far. We're 4 names in, and the gospel is being presented through the names. We see that mankind has been granted this mortality, and then Kenan's name. I don't know. But so that's where we are so far, right? Then you look at Mahalalel. Mahalalel's name means one who praises God. You could also phrase that as the God who is praised. That's pointing essentially to God. Yared's name means to descend. Enoch's name means to train or teach. Large agreement here across all of these. And so what you have is God descending to teach, right? So keep that in mind. Now, this is where the video really starts to go off the rails to make it work. He says Methuselah's name is his death shall bring. Methuselah, if you look at the dates, it appears though that Methuselah died the year of the flood. Almost like God was waiting for him to die to bring about the flood. Now, if his name meant his death shall bring, it's clear cut. He dies and God's it's time for the flood, right? But that's not what his name means. His name means man of weapon. That's not it, right? So, but again, we're back to, you can say that what's happening here is that God is descending on the earth that has gotten corrupted, that is broken, and He's bringing a weapon. He's bringing the flood, right? So we still have kind of this tie-in, right? We still see that it's almost like the flood story is being told in the names before we even get to the chapters that are about the flood, right? So mankind's broken, and God is descending with the flood. That's where we are. So then you get to Lamech. This is again where there's disagreement. The guy says it means despairing. Lamech's name is the Hebrew word for powerful. That's what it is. So you could almost attach it back to Methuselah. So God is bringing a powerful weapon, right? And then you have Noah, rest and comfort. That one says it right there in the text. It's kind of hard to miss, right? So what's happening? Basically, mankind is broken, corrupted, mortal. Everything's bad. God is bringing about a judgment, a powerful judgment, and yet He appoints a deliverer. Now, there's two things I want you to see here. Noah is both the deliverer of mankind in the moment he's in, because literally, physically, he's the reason that mankind keeps going. Like we live through the flood because of Noah. But then, let's take it the next step. He's also the deliverer of all of mankind, because if he doesn't survive the flood, God's promise, the seed, is snuffed out. Doesn't keep going. Right? So this is why I say it points to the gospel. Because Noah doesn't just deliver us from the flood. He doesn't just get us over the hump. In this moment, because of his faith, because he walks closely with God, he's the reason that Jesus is ever able to come about. He is the reason that we're all delivered in this moment. Noah delivers humanity physically and spiritually. There's two ways for you to read chapter 5. The passing of time, to the extent that you're irrelevant, and that's how the world should read a portion like chapter 5. Like, what are we doing with our time? What's going to make me matter after I die? It's 3 or 4 generations after I die when nobody remembers who I am. Or it can be about being a part of God's plan by walking with Him. The impact that the people in this story had on humanity isn't because they accomplished great things in and of themselves. It's because they walked with God. Their impact was how close they were to God and what He was doing. That's why we know their names. That's why we celebrate them. What are you doing with your time? Are you accomplishing all the things? Are you focusing on that degree, and that career, and that spouse? Again, I'm not saying any of those things are inherently bad, but where's your focus? What's your focus on? God, if you've taught before, you know that sometimes your own lesson hits you like a truck. And I have been struggling the last couple of weeks with just kind of this, like, I'm doing my seminary stuff, and I love teaching this class. I love being with you guys, but there's like, you get in those ruts where you think like, what am I doing with my life? Like, am I going to do anything that matters, right? And so I'm reading this lesson, and I realize the entire chapter hinges on Enoch. And the whole point is, everybody died except the guy who walked and loved God. He's the only one who made it. He's the only one who understood what the point of all humanity was. He's the only one who got why we're here. And I went, I forgot why I'm here. I'm not here to do whatever, to do the thing, to accomplish the stuff, live out the American dream. I'm here to walk with God. That's it. There's nothing else. And it's what's the foolishness is when you tell yourself, well, why would I want to do only that? Why would that? There's nothing. There's nothing on earth that can match the fulfillment, the completeness, the joy, the adventure. You think Enoch was like bored? When all of a sudden he gets like evaporated into heaven, do you think he was like, oh, gosh, I was really getting tired down there? Like, his life was an adventure. He did something crazy. Go read Elijah. Elijah, the other guy, right? He rides to heaven in a chariot of fire. It's never happened to me. Like, I've never experienced something like that. These guys got it. They got what the point of being here is. And it's just to walk with God. That's all that matters. And I want you guys to go get your degree and go get married and have kids, be fruitful and multiply. I want you guys to do all the things, right? But I want you to do them because you're walking with the Lord. I don't want you to use God as your means to those things. Like, well, if I go to church enough, God will bless me and I'll get the things. You got it backwards. Cart before the horse. Walk with God. He will fulfill you. Go read that. I just read the end of Job this week. It says he lived a full life, full of days. A double of everything after going through what is arguably the worst experience of anybody. But he got the point. It's to walk with God. That's all there was.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor of young adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.